We are live. Welcome to the unregistered live stream, the official live stream of Unregistered Academy. I am Thaddeus Russell, the founder and director of Unregistered Academy. In this show, we present the scholarship, the academic work, the debates, the conversations that we are having at the Academy. And to join us, to participate in our courses and our conversations, go to unregisteredacademy.com, which should be in the description. And you can join at multiple levels. Is the audio bad? Let me fix the audio. I don't know why it's bad. Can someone else, is my audio okay? Can you hear me? Is it low? It's a bit low, huh? It's fine. Thank you very much. Okay. So we are good. Yes. So if you would like to participate in our conversations, take our courses, and you can either take the live streaming courses or the live classroom courses or the streaming courses, just watch them passively. You can do either one. There's multiple membership options at unregisteredacademy.com. Tonight, I will be presenting pieces of two courses that we are offering. One is A Renegade History of the United States, which is obviously based on my book, A Renegade History of the United States, and also a course that is coming up in 2 weeks, The Bible, which will feature biblical scholars and experts of various kinds who will be guest lecturing on the Bible. You will see why this is relevant to tonight's presentation. So let me tell you what I am thinking about tonight and why I wanted to present what I am showing right now. Elon Musk, of course, possibly the biggest name in the news these days, even more than Donald Trump, who is devoting, from what we can tell, most or much of his time and energy and resources right now, and for many months now, to running the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, and directing, apparently, much of the operations of the Trump White House. Now, this is an amazing thing. If you just step back and think about it on one level, Elon Musk is reported to be worth more than $400 billion. And yet he spends, from what we can tell, and he tweets in the middle of the night, and it's pretty clear that he spends almost all of his time working. And with Doge, he's not making a dime. So he's volunteering his labor. Why is that? If I had $400 billion, and maybe you should ask yourselves, if you had $400 billion, would you work the way that Elon Musk works? Another question is that his companies, their mission is different than many or most capitalist enterprises. They, for the most part, I think this is even true for Tesla, are not only intended to make profit. They're very much intended, and he's been explicit about this in every case. This is Tesla, SpaceLink, SpaceX, the Boring Company, Neuralink. All of them have quite grand social purposes in their intentions. He wants to, and I think this is fair to say, he wants to transform the world. He wants to revolutionize the transportation systems, the communication systems, and now the political systems, American governance itself. So quite massive, grand, global ambitions. By the way, they go beyond the globe because, of course, he wants to colonize Mars as well. You simply can't find a human being in human history with larger ambitions. And he has quite a lot of competition. And we're going to be looking at some of his competitors for this grandiose, ambitious mentality in history. What is that? Because I'm assuming that most people watching this, maybe all of the people watching this, listening to this, don't have such ambitions. I've never met anybody who wanted to transform all of human existence, essentially. If you have $400 billion in the bank, why devote your life so assiduously, so relentlessly, and work all the time? Does anyone know what Elon Musk's house looks like, where he lives or house is? I don't. I've never seen any photos or videos inside of his homes. I don't know how he lives, but he has $400 billion. Now, if I had $400 billion, the insides of my houses would look fairly impressive. He does not want to show how he lives, and I have a suspicion that he doesn't live in such a grand way because he's working all the time. What car does he drive, or he has driven in? A Tesla. He only, as far as I know, he only drives Teslas, his own cars from his own company. Here we go. What clothes does Elon Musk wear? Kind of famously, he wears t-shirts and jeans and sneakers and trucker hats, even when he's in the Oval Office, as in yesterday. There's no way, if you didn't know that Elon Musk had $400 billion, there's no way from observing him and his self-presentation that he has more than an accountant's salary. He lives, I would say, a fairly ascetic life. Asceticism, self-renunciation for a greater purpose. The renunciation of one's own desires, individual desires and interests for the greater good. That is the definition of asceticism. A concept or a doctrine that was introduced by the ancient Greeks, in particular Plato in the Republic. And we have a course on Plato's Republic in which we very extensively examine this question. And then, though, it became amplified tremendously and codified and made into the largest cultural and social movement in human history, which was Christianity. So you see the doctrine of asceticism, again, the renunciation of one's own desires for God's purposes, for the greater good or for the community, in the core teachings of Jesus Christ and the Apostle Paul. And you can see this most clearly in the Gospel of Matthew, the Epistle to Romans, and the Gospel of John, all of which, as I said, we will examine closely in our Bible course, which begins in 2 weeks at Unregistered Academy. Now, Elon Musk appears to be an ascetic. I'm not saying he's never had a glass of wine. I'm not saying that he doesn't own anything that gives him material pleasure. I'm sure he owns plenty of things that do. But boy, I think it's obvious that he simply doesn't have time to enjoy the fruits of his wealth because he's so busy working, building these immense companies, and now overseeing the very governance of the United States of America. That is an ascetic life. It is, one could say, according to, as we're going to look at, the Protestant tradition, an exemplary life. It is what one is supposed to do if one is of great wealth, like Elon Musk. So I just find that very, very odd and confusing and strange, because I and no one I know, if they had $400 billion, would devote their lives to work rather than play and leisure and fun. Ask yourself that. If you got $400 billion given to you, what would you do with the rest of your life? Would you do what Elon Musk is doing? No, it's quite unusual. But the point of today's class is that he is not the only great capitalist in American history to live that way, to act that way, to take on immense social responsibilities. Again, he doesn't have to do this, but he does. And what is the scale of his responsibility that he's taken on? It's not just for the Earth, it's for the cosmos. He's now wanting to colonize planets. That's as big as it gets. We can also think of other capitalists like Bill Gates, who's quite similar. Bill Gates looks and dresses like an accountant. The second wealthiest man on Earth, or the third wealthiest man on Earth, and spends all of his time, this is according to many, many reports and his own telling, and there's no question about it, he spends basically all of his time working. Also, Bill Gates, like Elon Musk, has a very grand ambition to reform the world through his many initiatives, focusing mostly on health, very famously on COVID, vaccines. It doesn't matter the content. What matters here for our purposes is that he had that drive and that sense of obligation. He and Elon Musk feel like they can and should make the whole world a better place for all of humanity. Warren Buffett, one of the top 5 or 6 wealthiest men in the history of the world, still lives in a ranch house in Omaha, Nebraska, and wears sweaters that he's had for years and tennis shoes. Again, you would never know from observing him, like Bill Gates and Elon Musk, you would never have any idea that this is a wealthy man from the way he presents himself. These are ascetic individuals. They have more money than anyone else has in the history of the world, and yet they choose to spend all of their time continuing to work, which is just an amazing thing. For most people who are working class, meaning the vast majority of people, meaning those who must work for a living to survive, this is generally considered the craziest thing one can do, right? The dream for most people who work for a living is to win the lottery and retire immediately. Not so with these men, these capitalists, the most successful capitalists in human history. What is it about these men? And what I'm going to tell you tonight is that they are not the first great capitalists in American history to have such a mentality, to have such a mission, an ambition, and to carry it out through much of their life. So let's begin with arguably the most famous rich man and capitalist in American history, possibly world history, John D. Rockefeller. He was born in upstate New York in 1839. He moved with his family to Cleveland shortly after that, died in 1937. But in 1870, most famously and importantly, he founded the Standard Oil Company, which at the time was a virtual monopoly on the oil industry, the largest oil company in the world at the time. By the turn of the 20th century, he controlled 90% of all the oil in the United States. He was the wealthiest person in the United States and the world. He was the world's first billionaire. And at the height of his wealth in the early 20th century, he was worth 3% of the national economy. Now, if that's me, I'm spending the rest of my life on a really nice beach. But no, John D. Rockefeller spent most of the last 40 years after he built his wealth as a young man. He spent most of the last 40 years of his life giving away his money through philanthropy. These are just the most famous examples, but he gave away millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to countless philanthropies and charities and causes and government initiatives too. But the Rockefeller Foundation became the main conduit through which Rockefeller's money was transferred to these philanthropies. It still exists today. It is a major force in American culture and politics. It has been closely tied and allied with the US government for a century now, working hand in hand with various agencies of the US government. He founded the University of Chicago. He founded Rockefeller University, and he also founded, when the United States was colonizing the Philippines in the first half of the 20th century, he founded the Central Philippine University, whose mission was to educate Filipinos to be like Americans, to train them to become just like us. Again, imagine if you had Rockefeller's wealth. Is this what you would have done with it? Maybe you are one of these very unusual men in history. But I doubt you are. I have never met one. They exist, they have existed, and I'm pointing them out tonight, but they're very, very unusual. Now, Rockefeller is a picture, a portrait of his family, had many children. As you can see, this is from the 1920s. This is from his main biographer, Ron Chernow. It's a great biography, the best biography of Rockefeller. Chernow summarized Rockefeller's attitude toward asceticism and pleasure and work this way. He said, Rockefeller was, quote, a prisoner to the Protestant work ethic. He worked night and day. The wealthiest man on earth, again, like Warren Buffett, Elon Musk, and Bill Gates, just like them, he worked night and day, even though he had all that money, who attacked recreational interests with the same intensity that he had brought to business, meaning he attacked recreational interests as sinful. He was opposed to recreation itself. Next sentence, he engaged in strenuous rituals of austerity and grimly sought to simplify his life and reduce his wants. Now, when I tell people this, they are shocked, but this is in Chernow's biography. It's in multiple biographies of Rockefeller. It's also in biographies of his various children. Rockefeller was such an ascetic that at the height of his wealth and power and influence, the wealthiest man in the history of the world, he refused to buy his own children new clothes, so that the Rockefeller children pictured here were all wearing hand-me-downs. And in fact, his youngest son, John Jr., because of that, was forced to wear dresses and girls' clothing when he was a young child. That's how ascetic this man was. He refused to go to parties. He railed against the new consumer revolution of the early 20th century. Movies were invented. Coney Island and amusement parks were invented. Dime novels were invented, which were the sort of early cheap form of popular entertainment for many Americans. He scathingly rebuked all of those acts of pleasure undertaken by countless Americans during that time. He believed one's mission was to work and contribute to the community, the nation. And that is why, on a certain level, he devoted so much of his wealth, his fortune, to philanthropy. Again, though, the question remains, why? What an odd thing to do. What an odd thing to do for the wealthiest man on earth at the time. To refuse to buy new clothes for his own children. To scorn all indulgences. And to devote his entire life to labor. Here's another very important example who was a contemporary of Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, born in Scotland, immigrated to the United States, Pittsburgh specifically, soon in his early adulthood. Born in 1835, he died in 1919, so he was a contemporary of Rockefeller. These two men were considered the leading members of what were called the robber barons. The robber barons were the great capitalists of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, which one could say began after the Civil War in the 1860s and peaked in the 1920s. This is when the United States overtook Great Britain as the leading capitalist productive nation on earth. Carnegie founded the Carnegie Steel Corporation, which he later sold to J.P. Morgan, and which became the U.S. Steel Corporation in 1892. Carnegie and U.S. Steel were the largest steel corporations in the world at the time. He controlled nearly a monopoly stake or interest in the steel industry. And just like Rockefeller, in the last decades of Carnegie's life, he gave away 90% of his wealth to philanthropy. Most famously, to the Carnegie Endowment, Carnegie Hall, Carnegie Mellon University, and many other causes and institutions that many of you, I'm sure, have seen his name on. And Carnegie, unlike Rockefeller, explained why he did this. Again, being the second wealthiest man in the history of the world at the time, why he gave away the lion's share of his wealth to other people, to other causes, to institutions that did not benefit him at all. Why? Why do that? He wrote a very famous article called The Gospel of Wealth in 1889, in which he explains what he believed to be the obligation, the spiritual obligation of the wealthiest people on earth. What should one do if one becomes wealthy the way he was? And he says this then is held to be the duty of the man of wealth. First, to set an example of modest, unostentatious living. Like Rockefeller, like Carnegie, who himself worked all the time, even when he was the second wealthiest man. Shunning display or extravagance. That's asceticism. To provide moderately for the legitimate wants of those dependent upon him. Is he referring to family members? No. And after doing so, to consider all surplus revenues which come to him simply as trust funds, which he is called upon to administer, and strictly bound as a matter of duty to administer in the manner which, in his judgment, is best calculated to produce, here it is, the most beneficial results for the community. The man of wealth thus becoming the mere agent and trustee for his poorer brethren, bringing to their service his superior wisdom, experience, and ability to administer, doing for them better than they would or could do for themselves. So obviously there's a lot of paternalism in here. Carnegie, like Rockefeller and the other robber barons of the time, believed themselves to be the father of all people. They were super patriarchs, self-appointed super patriarchs, as you can see here, who were obligated by, there's another word for this, is noblesse oblige, the obligation of the rich to help the poor brethren. But this idea that he, because of his wealth, was obligated to uplift all the people with it. Again, very odd idea, very unusual, but there is a history of it. There is a source of it. It does not come out of nowhere. And where it comes from was pointed to by this man, Max Weber, a German sociologist who was also a contemporary of Rockefeller and Carnegie, born in 1864, died in 1920. His most famous work, and the work I am about to discuss, is called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, published in 1905. Max Weber had the exact same questions that I have. What on earth is driving these men to act this way, to live this way, with all of that money? They spend their days working and giving away their money. He was truly confused, baffled by this, so he wrote an entire book to explain it. And his explanation, his theory, his argument has been used ever since by sociologists, by political scientists, by historians, including yours truly, by analysts of capitalism, analysts of Protestantism, analysts of American history, modern American history, analysts of the history of robber barons and capitalists in this country, to explain why we have had men like John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and Elon Musk. Why they have acted in this way when they had all of that money. It's so curious. And what his argument resulted in, or what he pointed to, was this: the Protestant Reformation, which began, by most accounts, in 1517 with Martin Luther posting his 95 Theses on the door of a church in Wittenberg, Germany, protesting the corruption of the church at the time. And at that time, there was only one Christian church. It soon became known as the Catholic Church after the Protestant split from it. But at that time, he protested it. And the main protest of Luther and the Protestants was that the church had installed many, many different levels of hierarchy: priests, bishops, cardinals, popes, etc., between the people and God. When one was a member of the church, up until that point, one received salvation, at least a promise of salvation, from whom? Not God, but from the leaders of the church, who said, if you come to confession, if you admit your sins, if you pay tithes to the church, if you act in the ways that we tell you to, because of course the Bible was written in Latin at that point, and very few people in Europe were able to read Latin, but most of the priesthood was able to. So they translated literally the Bible to the laity, to the church members. And in so doing, Luther and the Protestants said there was an immense amount of corruption built in, because of course this is a tremendous opportunity for priests to line their own pockets by saying things like, if you pay the church a certain amount of money, you will go to heaven. But the main point here is that members of the church, which became known as the Catholic Church, believed generally that salvation came from doing right by the institutions of the church. And this was the problem, according to the Protestants. There was no longer a direct relationship between the people and God. All of these leaders of the church had intervened in between to translate and interpret the message of God to the people. In 1521, the Pope excommunicated Luther. And so Luther, in that year, published the Bible in German, a language that was understood by many people living in Europe. So now Protestants were saying the people are able to and should have a direct relationship with God through the Bible by reading it for themselves. Reading it for themselves, interpreting it for themselves, seeing the truth for themselves in the Bible, and therefore acting accordingly. In 1534, Henry VIII famously broke with the Pope and established the Anglican Church, otherwise known as the Church of England, one of the original Protestant denominations, arguably the most important Protestant denomination, which carried forward the ideas of Luther and to some extent John Calvin, which we'll discuss in a moment. Elon Musk was born into the Anglican Church, was baptized in the Anglican Church. His family is a wealthy, formerly British family who came from the Church of England. This is not a coincidence. In 1536, John Calvin published Institutes of the Christian Religion, which became the foundation for what we know as Puritanism in this country. It was the religion of the original Pilgrims, the Puritans who settled New England. And what Calvin and Luther and the Protestant theologians of the time argued, they argued multiple things, but about how one gets to heaven. They argued that as opposed to the church, the Catholic Church, telling people that salvation comes from obeying the church, to these men, to the Protestants, salvation comes from God himself. But the thing is, God has predetermined whether you go to heaven or not. Predestination. It is determined from before your birth whether you are saved, whether you will be saved. And God will not reveal this, and here's the rub. He will not reveal this until Judgment Day. So you don't know through your whole life whether you are one of those elected to ascend to heaven. So what Weber argues is that this created, and there's quite a lot of scholarship to support this, this created enormous anxiety among the Protestants, the new Protestants of the 16th and 17th centuries, the people who were breaking from the church, the Catholic Church, who were seeking and establishing a direct relationship with God by reading the Bible for themselves, thinking that they have been predetermined to either go to heaven or live in eternal damnation, but they don't know it, and they won't know it until Judgment Day, until the very end of their life, until their life is over. And so according to Max Weber, and according to many historians of early Protestantism, this has been fairly well documented, there was enormous anxiety among Protestants about what to do now that it is up to us and to God. And what happened is that Luther and Calvin introduced the idea of a calling to work, to be productive, and to introduce rationality and order to society, to contribute through one's work to society as a whole, to God's greater community of human beings, which extended to the entire planet, to all human beings, because of course Christianity is a universalistic religion. If one is pre-selected to ascend to heaven, one must still act in a godly way, which meant to them to work, to sacrifice oneself, to be selfless, in order to contribute to the greater good. This became known as the Protestant work ethic. One must work no matter what one individually gains from it, no matter what, because it is what God wants. It is the godly way to live. Jesus Christ himself, the most famous ascetic of all time, very famously sacrificed his very body, but he also sacrificed his material wealth. He had no material wealth. In fact, he scorned it. He lived a life of voluntary poverty. Why? To serve all of humankind. And we should all live like Christ in that way. This was the message of the early Protestants. It's not about giving confession and paying tithes to the church. It's about doing what God wants, and God wants you to work and to serve everyone, not your family, not your local community, not your local nation, but all of God's children. It is your duty and obligation to serve, to work to serve them, to renounce your own interests, your own desires, to do that. And so I think you might be able to understand why Elon Musk is who he is. Weber put it this way. This is the summary of his book. He says, brotherly love, since it may only be practiced for the glory of God and not in the service of the flesh, right? So brotherly love, godly love, Christian love is, of course, not about sex or fornication or any kind of bodily pleasure. It is not in the service of the flesh. Brotherly love is expressed in the first place in the fulfillment of the daily tasks given by the lex naturae, natural law, and in the process, this fulfillment assumes a peculiarly objective and impersonal character, that of service in the interest of the rational organization of our social environment. For the wonderfully purposeful organization and arrangement of this cosmos is, according both to the revelation of the Bible and to natural intuition, evidently designed by God to serve the utility of the human race. The last clause of that sentence to me is the best description of Elon Musk's career and life that I've seen. Imagine the anxiety of not knowing whether you are one of the elect, whether you will spend eternity in heaven or in hell, and not knowing that, but knowing that God wants you to contribute to all of his children. Think of the anxiety. Think of the work that will be compelled by that. I bet you many people watching this and listening to this feel that anxiety themselves. I feel it every day. I was raised an atheist, but I come from Protestant cultural stock. And so these ideas, these feelings get transmitted through the generations of the Protestant work ethic. You have been sinful if you have not put in a full day of productive labor. And I think many, many Americans have internalized that, especially because of the founders of American formal culture, the Puritans, who were Calvinists, who essentially invented this idea of predestination. And so this is why capitalism, Weber argues, took off in Protestant countries. This is why the great capitalists of the time, and still to this day, most of them, they're dominated by Protestants, because they have this eternal, relentless anxiety about proving themselves to be godly so that they can ascend to heaven. And when one has that kind of wealth, like Rockefeller, like Carnegie, like Musk, one must use that money for one purpose and one purpose only: not to buy mink coats and mansions and yachts, but to spend it on the people, as Weber said, on the entirety of the human race. And so here's a theory as to why Elon Musk does what he does, which is not to necessarily judge him negatively, because all of us in America have benefited to some extent, and I mean all of us, from Rockefeller's contributions, his philanthropies, from Carnegie's philanthropies and contributions, and Musk's perhaps contributions as well eventually. I haven't seen them yet, but he's certainly headed in that direction, if he is at all correct in his prognostications about what his companies will produce for humanity. And so I'd like for everyone to think about this. Does it make sense? This theory, does it apply to Musk? And if it does, what does that mean about our attitude toward him and toward the great capitalists who took on this role in history? I don't have an answer for that. I don't have a judgment for that. I have mixed feelings about that. The politics of it, I leave to you. But I do think this is a compelling argument that needs to be taken seriously, and has been taken seriously by generations of political and social analysts. but I haven't seen anyone apply it to Elon Musk, and it seems obvious to me this is the time to begin talking about Elon Musk and the Protestant ethic to help us explain why he is, who he is, and why he's done what he's done. So, with that, if you're interested in pursuing these topics more fully, join us at Unregistered Academy. We'll be teaching the Bible in 2 weeks, but also the Renegade History of the United States course covers this extensively as well. But we have many other courses on history, philosophy, geopolitics, and contemporary politics. Join us at unregisteredacademy.com, and I hope to see you in class. Thank you.